recently hold elections, and the elections resulted, we got the result of the elections almost 10 days ago. Today, I'll be talking about lessons from these elections, which globally was seen as an important event to resist populism and electoral authoritarianism. It is a very, how to say, popular event, but I would like to really situate it. I would like to situate the discussion of the Turkish elections in the comparative politics literature. And I would like to use the frameworks of comparative democratization, the literature on authoritarianism, populism, polarization, and finally opposition coordination and how opposition coordination interacts with the electoral systems. Turkish case is really a very important case in that sense because Turkey has been ruled by an authoritarian populist government in the last 21 years. It is also a hegemonic party system. And there is also a quite strong opposition in Turkey still. Which had won 2019 local elections or won some important municipalities like Istanbul, Izmir, the biggest metropolitan cities of Turkey in 2019 elections. And we're expected to win the 2020 elections according to many surveys. And we can talk about that as well. This is a question that pops up very frequently, why the surveys got wrong. This is not in my talk, but we can discuss it in the Q&A. As I said, the opposition was expected to win, but the opposition lost the election. So my talk will be answering this question, why the opposition lost, what could be the lessons from this election for the oppositional forces and for the oppositional political parties. But as I said, and as you see on your screen, my talk is also be responding to some debates within these literatures, consolidation of authoritarian rule, how the opposition really can take back democratic backsliding, and then it would contribute. I think the Turkish case contributes to the comparative democratization literature. But let me give you a little bit of background on Turkish politics. I'm sure many of you know, but some of you, assuming that some of you had not that much information about the alliances or the political party system in Turkey, by using the election data. Let me give you some background on that as well. So in Turkey right now, the political party competition structured around coalitions. This is new. One of the things that really affected the political party competition in this last election is this is a brand new system. This was tested in 2018 election, presidential election, after then 2019 local elections, and now this is the third time that Turkey is basically testing the coalitional political system. And we know that political party systems, electoral rules matter in terms of shaping number of the political parties, shaping voter preferences, and this is what we actually saw in this election as well. The coalition system and the change of the rules in the elections, in the electoral system a year before, really affected and shaped the behavior of the voters and as well as the political parties. And there were three major coalitions and a one, how to say, third party coalition, you could say, because these two coalitions here you can see, although they entered to the elections separately, they formed a loose alliance as well for the presidential election. And as a result, we had two major coalitions running for the presidential election and a one third-party candidate for the presidential elections. And the same alliance system and the alliance system for the parliamentary election was was similar as well. So the Cumhur İttifakı, this line, this bar, this gray bar, is the incumbents, which includes two major parties, one nationalist, one the governing party, Justice and Development Party, and several small parties. Millet İttifakı is also called Table of Six, and included conservatives, two conservative defecting parties from the AKP, and also one Islamist political party with democratic orientation, one nationalist political party which claims to be center-right, and also the major party in this alliance, in the National Alliance, is basically Republican People's Party, which is one of the oldest political parties in Turkey, representing more Western-oriented, secular values and attitudes of the voter. And the third alliance is the Labour and Solidarity Alliance, which includes pro-Kurdish political party as the main component, and also some leftist political parties. And finally, Ata İttifakı is the more nationalist among the all, which represented mostly anti-immigrant attitudes and anti-Kurdish attitudes. And they played the kingmaker role, specifically in the second round, changing the political landscape hugely between the two rounds. And again, we know from the political party and electoral system literature, the two-round majoritarian systems, specifically in polarized societies, basically radicalize the discourse of the political parties and radicalize the electorate. And this is what happened in Turkey as well. As we ended the elections, what we have experienced is the radicalization of demands, anti-immigration becoming one of the huge major issues of the Turkish political landscape, and also some other like familialism, anti-LGBTQ attitudes becoming more and more mainstream in the Turkish political sphere. I'll be talking about this, but this is one of the most important consequences of this election. We were expecting a path towards an opening of path towards democratization, but what happened in Turkey was vice versa. So I think this is the major puzzle of this talk, and also 2013, 2013, I can say the recent election. So this is pretty much the system, and also, or the coalitional system. And also we had two important elections at the same time, parliamentary elections and presidential elections, and the voter incentives and the party systems and alliances behave differently in those two elections and basically produce different results. In the parliamentary elections, incumbent government, the coalition, the government coalition, got almost 50% of the votes, and right now they have most of the legislative seats in the parliament. And the oppositional forces, the oppositional alliance, Nation Alliance, got 35 of the seats in the parliament. And with the participation, or with the support of the Labour and Solidarity Party, they cannot even reach to the level of the government. So the government now has the majority in the parliament. Opposition is very diversified in a sense as well, because many other parties, this is an electoral coalition. Then once you enter into parliament, these parties have their own groups in the parliament, may act differently, may co-opt by the incumbent government as well. This is something that we should watch as scholars working Turkish politics. Paths to co-optation and defection is something that I am expecting as well, but we can talk about that later on in the Q&A. Here's something that I also would like to share about the results of the Turkish elections, specifically in terms of party system and party support. When we look at the party support, although President Erdogan, the incumbent president, won the election again, for the third time, he is appointed as the president, and he has been ruling Turkey with Justice and Development Party for the last 21 years. What we experienced recently is that a significant drop in his political party in terms of the vote share. So it seems that people who voted for Justice and Development Party and Erdogan do not overlap. There is sort of a or what I can say is the voters basically punished the political party instead of the President Erdogan, because, again, for many reasons, but mostly because of the binary logic of the presidential system. So when you vote for either candidate in this binary election, then people who voted previously for President Erdogan didn't defect. And we can also discuss about the reasons for AKP voters not defecting en masse in this election. I'll be giving you some clues about that, but I have published another paper recently with my colleagues using survey data. We can talk about that as well, because it's important in a sense. It gives us clues about how and why people defect in electoral autocracies and stop supporting hegemonic political parties. This is the map and geography of the presidential elections, the results of, you see here the change in the geography or the topography of the voter preferences in the presidential elections. This is 2018 Turkish presidential elections, and this is 2023 Turkish presidential elections. As you can see in this map, mostly coastal areas closer to Europe vote for the opposition. This trend somehow continued, but got broader support in the Aegean region. But also most of the coastal regions in the Mediterranean as well began to support, not all of them, but predominantly, majority of these regions began to support the opposition. And here, as you can see, in the 2018 presidential elections, there was no joint candidate, and Turkish, Kurdish populated regions voted for the pro-Kurdish candidate. And here in the 2023, in the recent elections, the Kurdish regions also voted for the oppositional candidate, given that the opposition were in this loose alliance with the pro-Kurdish political party HDP. So what we see here in these recent elections, and also some other metropolitan major cities in the inner Anatolia, so we have a broader representation right now, almost circulating the government in a sense, trapping it inside, right, and encircling it in the coastal regions. This is something what we see in the United States as well, right? When we look at the populist voter share and the differences between Biden and Trump, Clinton and Trump, what we see is the Democrats basically got the coastal regions, and the populists got the inner regions. And the populist support has really this geographical rationale and geographical representational dynamic in it, which is rural-urban cleavage, basically. It really played an important role in Turkey as well, this rural-urban cleavage. And we can talk about the reasons why rural areas or small cities keep voting for more populist, authoritarian, nationalist political parties. And there are many reasons that is cited by the literature, which is replicated in the Turkish elections as well. But we can talk about that in the Q&A as well. And there's much to talk, because I do think that this election is really very representative in the sense that it really reflects all the broader trends of global populism, right-wing trends, opposition coordination, comparative democratization, as I said. So let me talk a little bit now. Again, this is still a background. but also the talk itself, about, like the populist authoritarian regime of Turkey, how the incumbents rule, how the regime is shaped, what are its governance mechanisms. First of all, as similar to many populist authoritarian regimes, in Turkey as well, elections are crucial for legitimacy, and political party competition in Turkey is present, and opposition can win the elections. This is, for example, something not similar to Russia, where you don't see a very meaningful political party opposition to Putin's United Russia. Right? United Russia gets 70%, sometimes 80% of the votes, and all the other political parties, and Putin himself gets a wide support. And there is no meaningful chance of the opposition winning the general elections or presidential or presidency. But Turkey, that was possible, and that was related to many factors. One is Turkey has a legacy of political competition, as opposed to Russia, for example, or other post-socialist countries with a more consolidated authoritarian regimes. This legacy also makes possible a more consolidated political party system with voter support. Right? That's one. History matters, or history of democratization matters when explaining political competition in authoritarian regimes. Second, Turkey's political regime is very polarized, and that polarization has a historical root as well, which is represented by the political parties. So polarization, we always talk about polarization as a negative thing. And the result is decay of the institutions and this and that. But sometimes polarization has this unintended consequence of increasing political party competition. Because in Turkey, almost 48% of the electorate. So the presidential race always ends up with this 52 for the government, 48 for the opposition in the last 10 years. Doesn't change. This number doesn't change. It basically is related to this opposition, because Turkey is now basically cut into two. On the one hand side, there is government with a more Islamist, conservative, nationalist voter representation, and on the other side, and this is not just only cleavage, but on the other side, when you see it from the presidential or the binary perspective, because presidentialism, as I said, introduces this binary logic to the system, and on the other side, you have more secular, Western-oriented, liberal-minded groups, more pro-democratic forces, in a sense, right? So that polarization really mobilizes the voters, and they don't really switch their votes to the other side depending on which one does better, right? It's in that sense more identity, and an identity as a result of this polarization. Right? Political parties, political polarization itself, it's like a chicken and egg situation, creates these identities, and these identities goes back and just reinforces polarization in Turkey. So what I'm trying to say, polarization really helped Turkey, in a sense, to keep its political party competition lively. And finally, President Erdogan is a populist, and as a populist, his electoral legitimacy is based on winning elections. So he cannot get rid of elections. I mean, every other authoritarian system has a different source of legitimacy. Military dictatorships, which Turkey also experienced. Turkey always experiences every form of global authoritarianism in a way or so, very reflecting authoritarian dynamics. Global authoritarian dynamics in its own way. But what I'm saying is that military dictatorship has a different sort of legitimacy, stability order, enabled by the military. And the populist authoritarianism derives its legitimacy from elections. So you have to keep elections, and you have to keep doing elections. This opens a path to the opposition to actually win the elections. But of course, this is an incumbent government uses large-scale abuses of power, changing the rules of the electoral competition, voting irregularities, control of the media, harassment of the opposition, a complete control over judiciary, which then is used to design the opposition itself. Many of the important oppositional figures, like the pro-Kurdish political parties leader Selahattin Demirtas, is in jail. So many other things, but there is still a path, a door for Turkish opposition to win the elections. So this is one. There is elections, but not free and fair, with opposition having chances to win. And there is also deinstitutionalization that we experience, which is related to this third aspect of charismatic leadership and personalization of power. Turkey completely got rid of checks and balances. It's not even weak anymore. I mean, completely got rid of checks and balances, lack of judicial independence, huge deinstitutionalization at every level of the government, which we experienced in the recent earthquake. This is related to a new form of authority. Turkey is a leadership-oriented political system right now. Some people call it Erdoganism, like Putinism in Russia. Some call it more executive-oriented political system, or super hyper presidential system. But at the end, it's a charismatic leadership with personalization of power. Erdogan is a charismatic leader. And ever since from Weber, we know that charismatic authority has really establishes these links with the electorate, this direct, emotional, and personal links, which is hard to break. This is what we experience as well, right? It's not anymore religiosity, for example. It's basically this personal appeal and personal connection of President Erdogan, like Modi in India, like Trump in the US, like many other populists, Orban in Hungary. And Erdogan among all of them is the longest ruling, and probably the most closest, strongest connection with his electorate, because he also has this other issues. I mean, he has the owner of other issues in Turkey as well, like the conservative issue or the religious freedoms, let me say. All of these things he owns as a leader. But we also experienced some institutional changes as well, like the direct election of the president in 2017, and then in 2018 switched to the presidential system, with presidents having a lot of power, executive power, and legislative powers curbed. After 2018, we also have ruling by decree, limited checks and balances, as I said. This goes to this idea of, after 2016 coup, president basically has this decree power, which basically, again, curbed the power of the Turkish parliament. I do think that many of the elements right now we are experiencing in Turkish politics could be labeled as pathological normalcy, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, as Casmuth calls it, or Frankenstein problem, like Kim Spelle calls it, which means most of the elements that we experience right now in our authoritarian system and the culture was already present previously in the Turkish authoritarian culture, system, institutions. But what this government did is basically took the familiar pieces of the previous era and put them together with master's outcomes. I mean, handpick all the authoritarian practices, and always, you know, like referring to we had this before. We had the leadership, we had the honor, we had this, we had religiosity, and this and that. So these pieces were familiar individually, but their coming together is completely new and very authoritarian. So I think that's also very important too, because it justifies and legitimizes the system as well, because it feels familiar to the elected as well. But it's not, I mean, but their coming together is brand new. We have never experienced this before. Here's the democracy indicators of Turkey. This is OECD indicators, the blue line, and the red line is the Turkish indicators. This is VDEM data. VDEM data, as you know, not only looks at democracy itself, but also checks and balances, right? Executive power, how the executive power is used, independent judiciary, and this and that, which is much larger in a sense. And here you can see Turkey moves like OECD, except this, but also, I mean, with a lower level of democracy, but with a similar, I mean, the way that the graph moves is similar to OECD graph, but with democratic breakdowns, 3 democratic breakdowns here in 1960, 1971, and 1980, which are military coups. And then democratic indicators after the 3rd military coup begins to rise, getting closer to the OECD averages, still lower, but getting closer. But then after the AKP got elected, begins to drop. This is something, you see the drop here in the OECD countries as well. We keep talking about global democratic decline happening in Turkey, but much sharply. This is a very sharp decline. And here you can see after 2016, after the coup d'etat, the failed coup attempt, here you can see Turkish democracy is right now closer to the military dictatorship era, and even to the 1910, 1920s. So all the democratic credentials that Turkey had, or the democratic improvements that Turkey experienced throughout the 20th century, we lost them in a way. What we basically still have is elections. And this is where the Turkish opposition and democratic forces basically got locked in to this electoral area, and which limits the opposition itself, because not in the, as I explained, in the electoral area, you have the government's upper hand as well through the control of the institutions. But again, that could have still been possible, that the opposition could have won the elections, like in Malaysia, for example. So this is democracy, but this is a recent survey that we did with my colleagues, asking to the elected about their views, whether Turkey is a democracy or not. No, we asked them to basically grade Turkish democracy from 1 to 10. And here you can see, this is the government's coalition. They do think Turkey is a democracy. Majority of them thinks that Turkey is a democracy, because their view of democracy has been transformed. This elected view of democracy has been transformed to a more majoritarian populist view of democracy and leadership-oriented democracy. We do elect the leader and he'll do whatever he wants without checks and balances. This is democracy. So completely different understandings of democracy among the Turkish electorate. Here you can see CHP, Good Party, and also HDP, Pro-Kurdish Political Party. They do think this Turkey is not a democracy at all. So this is a polarized society as well. I mean, the way that we think about concepts are completely different from each other, and we don't relate anymore when we say democracy. This keeps up coming in all the surveys, this very polarized view of democracy. And Turkey also experienced regime, what we call in comparative democratization literature, and which we all know, very important for re-democratization. Turkey experienced some regime debilitating events recently. Economic crisis, although the effect of the economic crisis is not similar in the big cities and in rural areas. Here comes the rural-urban cleavage. Because when inflation rises, it doesn't affect the rural areas as much as it does the urban areas. So there's no one economic crisis affecting everyone similarly, but there was economic crisis at the macro level. But looking at, as I said, looking at macro indicators doesn't explain much. Also, government really rested its electoral strategy a lot on government transfers, subsidies, and a huge electioneering economy that made the specifically poor voters or low-income voters not to feel the effects of the inflation that much. So you have that, but we have a huge economic crisis, which we keep experiencing. We had a devastating earthquake. Tens and thousands of people died. We don't still know how many died, how many people died. I mean, there's still construction going on, and it will keep going on. The recovery is going to be costly and long, and the government really didn't effectively responded to the earthquake in a way. But there is also polarized view of that as well. I'll show you. And also there's elite defection. Elite defection is also considered a regime debilitating effect by the comparative democratization literature. There were two major political parties in the opposition defected from the government. And that was also important. Here I'll show you, this is again from the same survey that we did in April. We asked to the respondents to evaluate the earthquake performance of the government. Here you see the same polarized view. The government's coalition basically thinks that government acted effectively, perfectly, responded perfectly to the earthquake, whereas the oppositional voters thinks that they did very poorly. So this political party polarization even shaped how people framed or saw or experienced the earthquake itself, right? It's an objective condition. What's happening out there? I mean, it's a major crisis, major disaster, but still your prior political identities shaped how you evaluated the performance itself, and in such a polarized view. So polarization, as I said, really calcified the voting preferences in a way, which is very difficult to change. And that polarization is also strengthened, as I say, with this binary logic of the presidential elections. So let me talk about again, what were the major cleavages in this election, what were competing in the recent election. These are important cleavages that incumbents basically used in the elections, utilized or in the elections, but these are not new. Some of the way that they were used may be new. I identified three cleavages that the incumbents use in the elections. As we know, the first one is populist cleavage that the AKP government, our government, has been utilizing, has been building its political discourse on since 2 decades. But religious freedoms and rights of authentic people grasped by the secular and inauthentic elites, right? This is the populist cleavage. Center periphery cleavage, some say conservative urban cleavage, I'm sorry, conservative secular cleavage. But the way that the government used it is in a very populist way. There were elites, secular elites, non-religious elites, unauthentic, inauthentic elites, more Western oriented, that's the opposition, and also this more religious people. It's this conservative secular cleavage which became very populist which framed by the populist language. And we know populism attaches itself different cleavages, ideologies. Here in Turkey, populism attached itself to religion, basically. Second, we have nativist cleavage, which is new. It's very brand new, basically, and it's different than the populist cleavage. The AKP government increasingly adopted in the last 5 years the agenda and discourse of global populist radical right of Europe, of Hungary, of Russia. And what is it? What's the agenda? It's the familialism, right? And gender, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. Even in the victory speech, the President Erdogan mentioned LGBTQ people 8 times in 5 minutes, as if this is an important problem in Turkey. It's not a major problem of Turkey, as in Europe. But it became very important. You see this nativist agenda of populist radical right and familialism became an important cleavage in Turkey in these recent elections. And I'm expecting it will shape more than the religious freedoms of Turkey's right-wing political agenda in the coming decades, like everywhere in the world. So the opposition needs to change its rhetoric in a way, responding not to the old nativist agenda, but this reappropriation of this new nativist agenda. Finally, we have nationalist cleavage. This is different than nativist cleavage. And I always resist this idea that when people talk about Turkish elections, or nationalism on the rise. Yes, nationalism was on the rise, but I do think it was nativism on the rise, not nationalism basically on the rise, because nationalism is pretty much stable in Turkish political landscape. And that is basically shaped by this strong state and security discourse, Erdogan representing a strong foreign policy approach, harsh penalties and securitization of Kurdish political movement, foreign policy activism, status seeking, and this and that. This nationalist agenda appropriated by AKP for many years and became more anti-Kurdish political movement in the last, after 2015, in the last 8-10 years. What did the opposition do in response to this? They also do have their populist cleavage, but they have a more leftist definition or interpretation of populist cleavage. This was more apparent in the local elections of 2019, where Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, used this, we are 99% of this country. You may remember this populist slogan from Occupy movements, 99 movement of this country. So the opposition used this more inclusive populist ideal and more inclusive approach to the concept of the people, and didn't really point out the elites as identity groups, but as thieves and people, corrupt people, this and that, people who are not in the system, but we're all together. Now, this is even appropriated by President Erdogan after the election. Right now, he's talking about, I'm representing Turkey, the whole Turkey kind of approach, which is a change in discourse. And we can talk about that as well. The opposition also has the nativist cleavage, their own version of nativist cleavage, which I think is also important, because this is also the agenda of the radical right, populist radical right of Europe, anti-immigration. So interestingly, both major factions represented a portion of radical right in their discourses. So Turkish society somehow got trapped in this nativist cleavage from both sides. You cannot really get rid of the nativist cleavage. And in this sense, the opposition's cleavage was, or the demand was, let me say differently, opposition underlined anti-immigration and represented anti-immigration attitudes. Whereas the government was, before the election, they didn't change their rhetoric radically, but they were more pro-migrant and also criticize the opposition for being not just, not human enough. This is interesting, really. I mean, usually in other countries, this nativist cleavage is represented by one political party, which is like a fringe political parties, got adopted, some of the demands got adopted by mainstream political parties. But here in Turkey, coalitions with mainstream political parties representing different agendas, two different agendas. I mean, there are two main agendas of the radical populist right, and either of them representing each demand. So finally, you have the nationalist cleavage. But you see, specifically in the first round, a strategic silence in terms of nationalist cleavage in the opposition, which many people argue that one of the results why the opposition lost the election, because they had no solution to the nationalist cleavage. They needed the Kurdish support, Kurdish voters' support to win the elections mathematically, but they also have to appeal to the nationalist voters, which is very difficult for Turkey, given that nationalism builds itself towards anti-Kurdish political mobilization. I'm not saying towards, they are not anti-Kurds, but they are anti-Kurdish political mobilizational actors. Right? So this support coming from, open support coming from pro-Kurdish political party hugely shaped nationalist voters and basically resulted with not, I mean, for them voting for Erdogan, whom they saw as this nationalist leader, the leader of the nation. And they didn't defect. And we see even, in fact, this ultra-nationalist party of coalitional partner of Erdogan even had a huge, I mean, did much better than expected, which was basically a response to this, this strategic silence in nationalist cleavage. Turkish nationalism basically struck back in a sense, so it was important. Two more cleavages that the opposition used: anti-Erdoganism, mobilizing anti-Erdogan votes, very apparent and salient in this election, not apparent and salient in 2019 elections. This became counterproductive as well because of this charismatic authority that people, this connection with Erdogan. And they also use democracy and authoritarianism cleavage. We are representing democratic forces, the other side is the authoritarian, but they didn't articulate it well, and they didn't really make it so salient and so open as they did in 2019. Mostly the opposition worked with specific demands without articulating them in a larger framework of what they want, what kind of a change they want for this society. They, of course, offered some institutional solutions, switched to parliamentarism and this and that, but not, you know, like not a cleavage. You need to really mobilize a certain cleavage. But that was something that the opposition was not really able to do. I'm skipping this because I think I'm running out of time. How much time I have? Not much. I forgot to
you 45 minutes, but you can go further, so you can spend more time. Yeah, don't worry.
This is I'm skipping this. I already explained this. This is my last slide. I'll just stop. Last two slides, maybe two, 3 minutes. I think other than this cleavages, what was important, and I'm using here Ong's book of Resisting Power, which is about opposition coordination in electoral autocracies, which came out last year, which is a great book that explains comparatively how opposition can defeat populist authoritarian regimes. And there she says there are two dilemmas that the opposition has in electoral authorities. The first one is opposition coordination, party coordination, party level coordination. And when there is high chances of winning, And when the system is presidential, this is very difficult to coordinate. And one more thing which is important is that if there are new parties in the system, which you do not know their relative power, it's also very difficult to coordinate. And in table of 6, 4 of the parties, 3 of the parties were new, brand new. So we didn't know their power, how much power they have. And furthermore, she says, what is also important is the number of the parties that are coordinating. And she says that you need to keep it small, specifically if it is presidential, because there's just one seat to share. So this is a problem. The opposition was very crowded, and there was a lot of intra-party and inter-party conflict, which was open to the public. I mean, we basically saw all the problems that the opposition had among each other, and that created lots of trust issues among the electorate of their capacity to govern. The second one is voter coordination. Ong says what you need to do is you need to coordinate the voters as well. And voter coordination requires overcoming pre-electoral ideological differences among opposition parties. So I am voting for this candidate as an Islamist to a secular Alevi person. Why? So you need to answer this question delinquently, which takes us back to the cleavages problem. Come up with a new cleavage and make it salient. Third, post-electoral uncertainty. Who is going to govern? So Turkish opposition came up with a very complicated governance mechanism. 8 presidential vice presidents, 7, 8, I guess. 8 vice presidents and 1 president with veto power. This is something that the authoritarian cultures, in quote unquote, which went through an 20-year authoritarianism and deinstitutionalization, would not swallow easily, to say it politely. I mean, it wasn't very convincing scheme of rule. Finally, uncertainty over the material consequences. Am I going to keep my position in the system, my economic position in the system? Am I going to get the social security benefits? So people want to secure what they already have. And you should not basically offer them too much change, which may cost them what they already have. So be slow in offering, change, and promise them that they would keep what they already have. This is something also the opposition failed to do. I mean, they were all about change and radical change in a crisis society. And they, of course, underestimated the government's capacity for compliance, information domination, resource distribution, institutional control. They didn't even respond to the disinformation campaigns, thinking that it's not true and it's not going to be effective among the electorate. But it became very effective in attracting nationalist votes. I'll stop here. I had some consequences listed. What would be the results, how the Turkish political landscape is going to be in the next decade or so. But we can talk about that in the Q&A with your questions. I'm sure you'll have questions about that as well. So thanks for listening. I'll stop share.
All right,
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was very, very useful and informative. And we also have a long period of electoral authoritarianism in South Korea. So a lot of things can resonate with our own experiences.
Yeah, in Ong's book, South Korea is one of the successful examples, yes.
Yes, so I'm sure that the audience has a lot of questions to ask. And Professor An has a question. Yeah, so Professor An, TK An, is a faculty member of our department.
Thank you very much for the interesting and informative presentation. My name is TK An, and I'm in the same department with Professor Park. I have 2 short questions. Number 1, would the opposition alliance have won the election in a fair and free election? And number 2, how does the geopolitical factor, how do the geopolitical factors such as the war in Ukraine play out among the voters of Turkey?
Of course. So as I said in my talk, elections in Turkey are not free and fair. There's a lot of video control. There's a lot of informational asymmetries. There's a lot of institutional authority of the government over elected bodies, which oversee the elections itself. But if you, and as I explained in the talk, the political mobilization in Turkey really is around elections. And there are lots of civil society initiatives, highly mobilized, like voting and beyond, mobilizing hundreds and thousands of people watching the election results to make it more or to make it less open to fraud, right? Electoral fraud. I'm not saying that there was fraud, there might be, but as again, the comparative party system literature, by referring to the comparative party system literature, in Turkey as well, this wasn't a very centralized fraud and corruption. Yes, there was a lot of irregularities, but it was mostly decentralized. So the incumbents transferred those, forms and patterns of fraud to the local authorities. So we keep hearing, like irregularities from this and that without a pattern. And it's very difficult to basically detect what happened when you don't have a pattern and a centralized control. I do think this is a more effective way of electoral fraud, right? Because the other really can put shadow on electoral legitimacy if you have this very centralized, similar pattern happening everywhere. So this happened, but overall, our estimation is the maybe irregularity is at most is like 1-2% change, which is very important because it basically changes the result itself. But what we also need to underline is that this was expected. So that sort of irregularity in the electoral system is an expected thing, which keeps happening in the last 7-8 elections, maybe even more, and in a similar way. So what the opposition kept saying is that we should get at least this 5-point difference in order to be able to win. So that this was already something that is known. I'm not saying that this is something that we should legitimize or accept, but this is the playing field, and that was known by the opposition, and opposition knew that it was not going to be free and fair in a sense. In the second question was about the geopolitical factors. I kept saying that, and I wrote about that as well. The opposition didn't have a positive foreign policy agenda when compared to the government, for many factors, because the government's legitimizing ideology has become geopolitics in the last decade. This strong state selling drones to Ukraine, being present in Syria, accepting this many refugees in its own country and controlling them, Turkey resisting to the West, and this and that, and status seeking, becoming regional hub, regional power, is very important for the nationalist voter. And it played a lot of role, strong leadership skills. And if I directly answer your question, yes, geopolitics was very important for the government, and they played it very well in a sense. But since Turkey had many other problems as well, it didn't really become the most apparent thing, the foreign policy aspect. Strong leadership became very important. That's tied to foreign policy. Foreign policy is one of the strong leadership aspects, but it was not just that. It was more than that. It was economy, institutions, governing capacity. So people were more domestically concerned this time. The electorate was more domestically oriented this time. And also in terms of the opposition, these, as I said, opposition is more West-oriented and promised to go back to the Western security architecture, contributing more to the Western security architecture. But I do think that, first of all, among the Western actors, there wasn't a positive political agenda. There hasn't been a positive political agenda towards Turkey. When AKP came to power, there was, right? Turkey becoming member of Europe, Turkey being in Europe, and this and that. But this time, Europe didn't even want, I mean, the European Union and also Europe in general, didn't really see or know how they would have dealt if the opposition wins Turkey. What would be the possible path of re-entry of Turkey to the European politics, normatively speaking, for example. So there wasn't a positive path for Turkey available to the opposition to tell to the domestic audience. So they kept very silent about foreign policy and geopolitical issues. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the candidate, had 2 videos, one on trade routes, Silk Road, coming up with this different idea of a trade route from Turkmenistan to Turkey, goes through Mediterranean to Europe. So this project, and also he once criticized very harshly Russia for intervening to the Turkish elections. And that was it.
Thank you very
And
much.
sometimes they talked about being pro-European, pro-EU, but on the basis of human rights and democracy mostly. You're welcome.
Yeah, I have a quick question about electoral institution in Turkey and the runoff election. So the runoff election, who introduced the runoff election? What was the intention of the runoff election? And do you think the runoff election is an obstacle for the opposition party to win the presidential election? Because the reason I ask you this question is the situation in France is kind of opposite of Turkey. So the runoff election is kind of obstacle for the right-wing politician in France, like Le Pen, to prevent them taking over the presidency. So the Le Pen lost the runoff election several times to Hollande and the coalition left or center. So do you think runoff election is a big obstacle for the opposition coalition in Turkey? And do you think what factors makes that as a main obstacle?
Okay, I think the problem in the case of this recent election, the opposition had this idea that they would have won and they should have won the election in the first round, right? And I do think that was a mistake, because when there is a lot of different cleavages among the electorate, a second round basically automatically creates the coalitionary dynamics, right? And didn't really puts a lot of pressure on the candidate, oppositional candidate, to come up with a new cleavage. But for various reasons, and this is something that came up in social media a lot, for example, and the leaders of the opposition kept underlining this. There could be lots of irregularities in the second election if we don't win in the first election, which turned out to be incorrect. And but they kept saying that, and either for mobilizing voters, which was a wrong strategy, or because they have they basically exaggerate the capacity of government than it already has, right? This is also a tendency, exaggerating the incumbents' capacity to control, and for various reasons, they basically created their coordination strategy to win in the first round, and almost skipped this possibility of coalitionary or the possibility of establishing a coalition for the second round automatically. So that was a problem. And the second round is, of course, I mean, it's institutional requirement. You need the 50%, 50 plus one of the votes in order to get elected for the president. But this was the first time that the Turkish system basically experienced the second round. We didn't know about the dynamics, patterns, changes in the system. We know nothing about the second round and how the electorate is going to respond to the second round and this and that. So it was quite an experiment in that sense as well. This election was, social scientifically speaking, is really quite an experiment.
Okay, so I have a quick question from the Professor Lee. And the Professor Lee's question is, Turkey is not an EU member state. And having said that, EU was not a factor either for the governing nor the opposition coalition. Does she think? So do you think it is always like this, or
Can I just hear the question again? I didn't quite get it.
Oh, okay. So the question is, the Turkey is not an EU member state. Having said that, EU was not a factor either for the governing nor the opposition coalition.
Okay, now I got that. Yes, Turkey is not an EU member state, but Turkey has been on the membership path since 2005, even more. I mean, officially 2005, but even before, Turkey has always aspired to become a member state, and also had customs union, which transformed Turkish economy radically in 1995. So Turkish EU relations is very crucial for the Turkish Republic ever since 1960s, 70s, even before EU. So, and after 1980s, always had this idea, Turkey always had this idea of become a member, and it's an official, and it's in the official process of becoming a candidate, although it's frozen. So since it's frozen, and since the EU is not basically offering any sort of reward to any kind of actor in Turkey upon democratic conditionality, right? What the EU power was used to have is that this democratic conditionality, democratize, and I'll do the customs union, I'll revise the customs union, democratize, and I'll sign this and that. The EU agenda shifted mostly towards keeping migrants in Turkey, which basically shaped their attitude towards Turkey since 2013, maybe, because it's a domestic EU problem. And for the individual countries as well, the migration became a most important cleavage in their own countries, and they wanted to keep the migrants away. And Turkey became this hub state, or this garrison state, whatever you call that, keeps the migrant away from Turkey. And the Erdogan government had, it was Davutoğlu, but basically the incumbent government had several agreements with EU, return agreements with EU, and EU governments know that Turkey, EU governments know that the Erdogan government, or let me say differently, they do predict well what the Erdogan government, and more, what the Erdogan government would do with the migrants. And for the opposition, they kept, I explained that they are very anti-immigrant. And they kept saying that we'll renegotiate the terms of these agreements with the EU. We'll send all the migrants back to Syria. That was terrifying for the EU governments, I would say. And they kept asking about, whenever we talk with the Europeans, they kept asking about the migration problem, what the opposition would do with the migrants. Will they send migrants to Europe? Will they open the doors and this and that? Very terrifying in a sense, because it was very uncertain policy proposals given by the opposition. And I think that really created one of the problems why the EU didn't have a positive agenda for the opposition. But in general, I do think that the EU does not have a positive agenda for Turkey anymore. They just want this transsectional relationship to go on. It's mostly transsectional. It doesn't have a normative component. And I'm not expecting even the update of the customs union or visa liberation, maybe just bits and pieces, mostly security cooperation vis-a-vis Ukraine. And that is done through mostly NATO, not EU. And right now, the major problem of the Western governments or the transatlantic alliance is Turkey's approval of the Swedish membership to NATO. And in return, maybe Turkey get a renewal of its deal for F-16s. Some of the security negotiations, security-related negotiations with the US. But it's a transactional relationship now, and mostly done bilaterally from government to government.
So I have two registered questions. From one is Elif Shelter. You have a question? Yeah, and the second question is Ege Yagi. You have another second. Yeah, you are in the order. So Elif Center.
Yeah. Merhaba hocam, thank you so much for this speech. It was very informative and excellent. So one of the most puzzling outcomes of this election for both Turkish people and also for people who are living outside Turkey was that there was really interesting parts about this election. One of them was the earthquake cost was really big, but still people living in those regions voted for Erdogan. And according to Syrian Barometer, 80% of Turkish people, they want Syrian refugees to leave the country, but still cities in the Syrian border, they voted for Erdogan. And also the economic grievances, like they're huge and widespread, especially among the rural people, but still rural people voted for the Erdogan. So it's kind of really puzzling for both Turkish people and also people who are looking at Turkey from outside. So my question is, does what being a partisan or voter has changed in Turkey after Erdogan has started to use a populist discourse, especially nativist and religious discourse in Turkey? Or do Turkish people dispositionally have an expressive partisanship rather than an instrumental partisanship? So they do not really evaluate and follow or mobilize over, performance indexes or like economic situation in Turkey. So they do not really, take those kind of parts and problems in Turkey into account, but they do only follow the symbolic discourses or populist discourses, because Erdogan was actually like spreading fear among voters in these elections. If you do not vote for me, this country is going to collapse, or you're going to be terrorists, or you're going to be peoples who are throwing their religions away. So these discourses were really fearful. So do you think what a partisan or a voter is defined in Turkey has changed? My questions, thank you.
Okay, thank you for asking this. I tried to answer some of them during my presentation, specifically the earthquake question, for example. When I showed the results of the survey that we did with my colleagues, we also asked them whether, in the earthquake regions, whether they would be voting for the opposition alliance or the government alliance. And we did some ethnographic research for that, answering that question as well. There are many reasons. But the first is this structural reason, and the structural reason being that, or the systemic reason, as you said, Turkey is a very polarized society, and the prior identity is And that prior identities is not just religious conservative, but also related to Erdogan, anti-Erdoganism. This appeal, direct and connection to the leader is very important right now. It's a very important cleavage in Turkey. So that shaped their evaluation of the government's performance as well, right? So your prior political identity shaping your view over the performance indicators of the government, and which was so apparent. What was very clear, what was very important for the opposition, either for the opposition and the government, is to appeal to the swing voters. So the calcified voters in Turkey do not change their voting preferences. This is similar again in the US, very similar, right? Calcified Democratic voters, calcified Republican voters, they don't change their voting preferences, whatever happens. Yani nothing really matters for those calcified voters. But in between, you have some swing voters, which may change their minds. So you need to appeal to those voters. That's, I mean, when I explain party coordination, political party coordination, voter coordination, I'm basically talking about that 20%, which was basically undecided up until the last minute, right? And their decision, we thought, could have enormous effects on Turkish elections, and it did. Because how you convince them is very important. And we also know that majority of them were nationalist people, right? Given that most of them voted for the nationalist political third-party candidates, 5% of them, and also based on nationalism. So again, it was in your question. For these voters, this disinformation maybe, or these appeals, nationalist appeals really mattered a lot. First, and also second, what really mattered for them is the capacity of the opposition to govern. And this is something that I try to explain, this uncertainty aspect. And that's true for the economic crisis. We did a survey, a study, and also wrote an article on that, explaining defection. The title of the article is Explaining Defection, Why People Defect from the Hegemonic Party. And the question we asked, under the economic crisis, when you are basically experiencing this huge economic crisis, why don't you defect? Or why do you defect? And what we found out was basically calcified voters don't defect. That's a fact. It just appears there too. Whether they're experiencing economic crisis or not, they don't defect. And that's explained by religiosity, conservatism, closeness to Erdogan, their views on democracy, Turkish democracy, and this and that. But for many reasons, their votes are calcified. The possibility of defection is the lowest among the low-income voters. That was very surprising to us because we usually expect when economic crisis happens, people with the lowest income defects more quickly, right? Because they got, I mean, their economic condition gets worse and worse, and they basically report their economic conditions getting worse, but they don't defect. And the reason that they don't defect is their vulnerability. Vulnerable groups like the earthquake survivors, when there is a crisis situation, needs more trust from the opposition. It's easier for them to defect when there is no crisis. When they know that their condition will remain the same, they'll keep their privileges, they'll keep their status, whatever they have, or social transfers, right? Which is huge in Turkey. So what we found in that paper is when there is more vulnerability, there is less defection. I mean, middle class people more easily defect because they have other ways if something goes wrong to recover. But the others need more trust. And that's where the policy coordination, opposition coordination, building trust, creating direct networks and relations with the elected is very important for the opposition. Trust is the crucial variable here. Trusting to the opposition, I would say. And trust meaning that their capacity to govern.
Okay, the last question goes to Ege Yagi.
I would first like to thank you for this well-prepared presentation. I got two questions actually. First one is about considering that populism and identity politics are in rise in Turkey in a very rapidly polarizing political landscape, and as well as Turkey as a whole. Do you think it is plausible to predict that the Turkish government will be able to preserve its authoritarian and centralized power in both short run and the long run? And do you think it is sustainable? My second question will be about the upcoming local elections. What do you think the opposition should inquire from the recent loss, and how do you think the opposition should change or modify their policies, especially considering the ongoing tensions post elections?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. The first question was about authoritarian consolidation in Turkey. And I also wrote about this as well. As long as the government stays populist, there won't be authoritarian consolidation first, because populism creates this very calcified, polarized dynamic, which resists strongly to the consolidation of authoritarianism, right? They don't sort of basically sign to the authoritarian bargain, right? Because you need a societal bargain for authoritarianism. But this last electoral defeat is, I think, could be the key turning point. And this is something I also wrote, in a way that the opposition electorate, not the political parties, but the electorate, should believe in the possibility of winning elections in order to have this resistance to power. So when you don't have that hope, when you keep saying that this is because of electoral fraud, they will win whatever we do, then you stop trying. Basically, this electoral defeat, and also the way that the oppositional political parties frame it. They don't frame it as their own loss, but they frame it as because this was an unfair game. But you knew that it was it was going to be an unfair game. So I think that oppositional discourse of framing defeat is also very important for the consolidation of authoritarianism. And they are doing a very bad job, I would say, right now, not being able to directly touch to the feelings of the oppositional electorate, not mobilizing them, not giving hope, not explaining why they lost, not basically taking responsibility for the electoral loss, and even blaming the electorate itself for not going to the polls and this and that. I mean, I am not very optimistic in a sense. We'll see. And if you look at the new recently appointed ministers of President Erdogan, you see a wide variety of conservative, nationalist, Kurdish ministers. And Erdogan right now, in last week, although he still attacks LGBTQ, he still uses this familial discourse. He doesn't use the polarized language that much as he used to. I mean, he basically refers to, I am the president of everyone. That's the talk he gave just yesterday. I'm going to be representing everyone. I am open to everyone. This door is open to you. Whoever you voted in the elections. This is basically a shift from more polarizing language. I'm not sure whether this is going to take root after 20 years of polarization. But on the top of defeat, it may. Without defeat, it could have not been. But on the top of this defeat and loss of hope, Erdogan may resort to more inclusive, nationalist and authoritarian path. Right? This is a populist, exclusive authoritarian path. These two paths create different consequences for the consolidation of authoritarianism. And the second path being more effective, because that's Putin's path, for example. I mean, he still attacks LGBTQ, he has the familial language, but he doesn't attack any single historical period of Russia. He even embraces Stalin, he embraces the Tsarist period and this and that. In Turkey, Erdogan singled out, for example, secular periods as the evil period and sources of all evil, secular people as not authentic people. If this changed, we will see from populist path, a shift from populist path to more nationalist Putin style path in Turkey. And I always talked about this idea that Turkey, we didn't had to have sort of something similar to Putinism. We all have its mechanisms, but Erdoganism is not as consolidated, as strong as Putinism. We may see, we'll see. This depends on oppositional strength again, and I'm not so sure about that anymore. We may see Putinism like Erdoganism in his last term, Milli Reis dönemi. From being reis, this chief, this leader, we'll see national chief, national leader kind of in his last term. I'm following that developments, but this is a very good question in a sense, in following that development as well. And the second question, after talking this much, I forgot the second question. What was it?
Upcoming.
I asked,
Yeah. No, go ahead again.
thank you. I asked about what the opposition should inquire from this loss, and
Yes.
how it should change its policies, or whether it should.
Okay, now I remember. Yeah, I think this was hidden in my first response. They had to own responsibility first and explain to the elected why they lost, and then gave hope, and mobilize, and in a different way with different leaders, with different strategies, right? In order to give hope, because right now, I mean, people are on antidepressants. It's a huge emotional, it's an emotional map changed, really. I mean, this is not a social scientific concept, but it does. Maybe social psychology does it more. And it's important for the party politics as well. This whole emotional map of Turkey changed in a way in the last month or so, and there is no one leading that emotional landscape among the leadership. Which I think is very important. And that's one. So you need a different social mobilization strategies, different political party strategies. But on the top of that, I do think, institutionally speaking, as talking from electoral politics perspective, it's easier for opposition coordination for local elections, much easier. More seats to distribute, much stronger in the cities, rural areas, much easier to monitor fraud in the elections, specifically in the cities. Lots of things give a lot of advantages to the opposition in the local elections, being urban powers. I mean, representing the urban opposition, right? And they may still get the majority of the urban municipalities and the metropolitan cities, but they need to coordinate, keep coordinating, but not just that, they have to change, I guess, and own the responsibility of why this happened.
Okay, any more questions before we close our discussion? It's very informative and educational.
I have one question regarding Turkey and Syrian relations.
Okay.
Like this. I'm sorry. I'm still kind of rearranging my thoughts.
Sure, of course.
Like Erdogan has been, in Erdogan's era, the relation between Turkey and Syria has been soured after 2011, the Arab Spring, and recently Russia made its claim to be a mediator between normalization of relations between Turkey and Syria. But in recent Arab League summit, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad blamed Turkey to be like neo-Osmanism in its expansionist and revisionist position in Middle East, and its occupation in Northeast Syria. What do you expect in Turkish foreign policy in its role in its expanding role in Middle East?
I mean, Middle East is a different subject, but let me start with Syria and say a couple of words about the Middle East too. The recent appointment, first of all, Turkey wants to normalize its relations with the Middle Eastern powers since the last 3 years or so. Wants to normalize and negotiate with Assad as well, as you said, mostly to facilitate the return of the refugees and also solve the problem of Idlib. And also, this is something that Russia asks as well, right? So this normalization is on the agenda. And I think the recent appointment of national intelligence, head of the National Intelligence Organization of Turkey as the foreign minister, is a signal for that, normalizing the relations. I mean, he's going to negotiate this normalization, or he's going to basically lead this normalization process with Syria. This is something that's expected from him. And he knows the terrain well. He has been the head of National Intelligence Organization for a decade, ever since the Syrian war started. And I think that's going to be his role. It's not going to be easy. It's not just let's normalize, as you know, huge problems in Kurdish areas, in Turkey-dominated areas, whether Turkey is going to pull out its soldiers from Syria. This is #1 condition of Assad, but Turkey wants border security, safe zones, still emphasizes those demands. And I'm not sure whether it's going to go through and be solved in the short term, but this is now definitely on the agenda of Turkey to normalize with Syria and find a solution to the border security and to the migrant problem. And Syria is not going to normalize for some time as well. I mean, it definitely is not like as it was 5 years ago, but Syria has a lot of huge issues as well. I mean, you need to Syria needs to first solve its own issues and problems but external cooperation and willingness to solve these problems is crucial, I guess. And Turkey has been an active actor in the conflict, and its willingness is an important turning point, I think, in re-establishing a sort of a post-war Syria. In terms of Middle East, Turkey wants to be the regional power, wants to leave its footprint in the conflict zones in the region as well. Militarily present now, Libya, Syria, have military bases in Qatar. So expanded really militarily, but has been on the track of normalization with the Middle Eastern countries, mostly responding to the normalization efforts among other countries in the Middle East, you know, the Arab League, the Gulf countries, rapprochement with Israel, lots of developments in Libya and this and that. So Turkey is basically following that footsteps. And also Turkey wants to be included in the East Mediterranean gas cooperation alliance to be able to extract gas and to become the hub for Eastern Mediterranean gas. So in order to do that, and that's important for Turkey's energy independence, specifically independence from Russia, because right now Turkey is energy dependent to Russia. So one has to normalize in the Middle East with Israel, with Egypt, with Syria, with Greece and Cyprus too. So we'll see more of an effort of normalization. And in many spheres, this may be the period of not normative change, not democratization, but sort of have to say, reducing the tone, tone of, you know, the discourse. You could call not democratization, but you could call, quote unquote, a period that seeks normalization.
Okay, so I think this is it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please join me. Thank you, Professor Evren Balta, for the excellent conversation about Turkish politics and election. That we will have you another time and
Hopefully.
update about Turkish politics and democratization. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for